You won't believe what happened when the HOA tried to take my land and declare it community property, and how I fought back with electrified fences. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. It all started one dreary Thursday morning when I received an official-looking letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA. As I glanced at the envelope, something about the bold, all-cap lettering made my stomach twist. At first glance, I thought it might be a mistake or some routine notice. I had no idea it was about to change everything. The letter was full of legal jargon, and I had to reread it several times to understand its contents. The HOA, led by none other than Karen, the president of the association, had decided that part of my private ranch was now considered community land. I was stunned. There was no way this could be right. My ranch had been in my family for generations, and the boundaries were as clear as day. I'd built my fences, planted my trees, and cared for the land as my ancestors had done for hundreds of years. I owned every inch of it, or at least I thought I did. The letter claimed that my land was to be included in an expanded community area that would be shared by the neighborhood. It didn't mention anything about asking me for permission or discussing it with me beforehand. It was simply presented as a fait accompli. At first, I thought it was some kind of error. I figured maybe the HOA had made a mistake, mixing up property lines or confusing my land with someone else's. So I called the HOA office to ask for clarification. They were dismissive on the phone, insisting that the decision had already been made. Karen's leading the effort, the representative said flatly, and it's in the best interest of the community. We're expanding the green space for everyone. I felt my anger rise. What right did Karen or anyone else in the HOA have to decide what happens on my land? I paid property taxes on this land. It was legally mine. But as I dug deeper, it became clear that Karen wasn't just the HOA president. She was also an activist for community betterment, whatever that meant. This wasn't about parks or space for kids to play. This was about power and control. Karen had a reputation in the neighborhood. Everyone knew she had an inflated sense of authority and believed she knew what was best for everyone. She frequently referred to herself as the guardian of the neighborhood, as if she were some kind of self-appointed ruler. Over the years, she had pushed several questionable projects through the HOA, often disregarding the wishes of others. This, however, was different. Claiming that part of my private property was now community land wasn't just a questionable move, it was downright illegal. But Karen was so confident, so certain in her righteousness, that she refused to acknowledge my property rights. She insisted that the land surrounding my house was simply too valuable to be kept private. According to her, there weren't enough green spaces for the growing community, and my ranch could be part of the solution. The nerve of her! I tried reasoning with her, explaining the legalities and the history of my land. I told her that I had proof that my ranch was private property, and I was more than willing to go to court to defend it. But Karen simply waved me off, saying, "You'll have to get a lawyer if you really want to fight this. We're just trying to help the neighborhood." As if that somehow made it acceptable to take what wasn't hers to take. As if it were for the greater good. I knew this was no longer about community. This was about Karen and her ambitions. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. The HOA had no legal claim over my land, but they were certainly going to try to push me around. That's when I started thinking about how to defend my land, not just with legal documents and expensive lawyers, but with something more personal, something that would make Karen and the HOA think twice before crossing me. I realized that the time for calm negotiation had passed. The HOA had been disrespecting my rights for too long. I had to show them that I wasn't going to back down. Karen's power trip was taking a toll on me mentally and emotionally, but I knew that I needed to act. I consulted with a lawyer to discuss my legal rights and get advice on how to handle the situation. The lawyer confirmed what I already suspected. The HOA had absolutely no right to claim my land. The land was mine, and there were no clauses in the HOA agreement that allowed them to take it. It was a simple case of a power-hungry president overstepping her bounds. But there was a problem. Legal battles could drag on for months, even years, and I didn't have time to wait. I needed a solution that would be fast and effective. That's when the idea came to me. Something drastic, something that would get the HOA's attention and make them think twice before attempting to take any more of my land. I needed to set a clear boundary, one that would be impossible to ignore. Electrified fences. Yes, it might sound extreme, but sometimes you need to fight fire with fire. If Karen wanted to challenge my authority, I was more than ready to show her what happens when you push the wrong person too far. I knew it would be controversial. People would talk, the HOA would threaten to fine me, and Karen would certainly be upset. But it was the only thing I could think of that would definitively draw the line between what was mine and what was hers, or, more accurately, what she thought she could take. It wasn't just about the electrified fences, though. It was about making a statement. It was about reminding Karen and the HOA that this land was mine, and no amount of pressure from them would ever change that. Once I made up my mind to install electrified fences, I knew I had to move quickly. I didn't want to give Karen or the HOA any more time to manipulate the situation in their favor. I spent the next few days researching what I needed to set up the electrified fences and how to do it legally. I made sure everything was above board. No surprise fines or legal consequences for this project. The lawyer I consulted reassured me that as long as I followed local regulations on safety and property boundaries, I was in the clear. The idea behind the electrified fences wasn't to hurt anyone, but to make it clear to Karen and the HOA that my property was off limits. I didn't want them trespassing or trying to force their way onto my land. This wasn't just about the legal fight anymore. It was about sending a message. I was determined to make it so obvious that my land was untouchable that even Karen wouldn't dare try to push her agenda any further. I hired a contractor who specialized in installing electrified fences. They were familiar with all the legal guidelines for such installations, which made the process smoother. The fence itself was high and sturdy, made of reinforced steel with electrified wiring running along the top, and its several key points along the perimeter. I made sure it was designed in a way that wouldn't hurt anyone who accidentally touched it, but it would definitely give them a shocking reminder to stay away. As the installation began, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. Was I doing the right thing? Was I escalating the situation too much? But as the fence took shape, I realized how necessary it was. This was my land, and I had every right to protect it. The HOA had tried to force their way in with their demands, and I wasn't going to let them. Karen had crossed the line when she assumed she could take what wasn't hers, and now it was time to show her just how serious I was. By the time the fence was finished, it was an imposing sight. The high metal structure, with the faint hum of electricity running through the wires, created an unmistakable barrier. I stood back to admire it. Not only did it look formidable, but it also symbolized my commitment to defending what was rightfully mine. There was no way Karen or any of her followers could now claim they didn't know where my property began and hers ended. The message was clear: stay off my land. But of course, Karen didn't take kindly to this development. I wasn't surprised when she showed up on my doorstep a few days after the fence was completed. She had that look of righteous indignation on her face that I had become all too familiar with. "What is this, a prison?" she demanded, gesturing toward the electrified fence. Her tone dripped with sarcasm, but beneath it was a vein of real anger. She had never been one to back down when she felt her authority was being challenged, and she wasn't about to let me stand in her way now. I stood firm. "It's a fence," I said calmly. "A fence to protect my property, as it's always been. The only difference is that now, people will know not to trespass." She scoffed. "You can't just go around putting up electric fences on your property. That's illegal. You're threatening the entire neighborhood." I knew she would try to make it sound like I was the one in the wrong. Karen had a knack for twisting things to suit her narrative, but I wasn't going to let her bully me into backing down. "The fence is perfectly legal," I responded, "and if you or anyone else has a problem with it, you're welcome to take it up with my lawyer. But as of right now, I'm just protecting my land from unauthorized access." Karen wasn't convinced. She marched off in a huff, muttering about how she'd be reporting me to the HOA board. She probably thought that once the HOA heard her side of the story, they would make me take the fence down. But I had a feeling the HOA wouldn't be on her side this time. After all, they had no legal grounds to enforce her demands, especially after my lawyer had confirmed that my property rights were secure. What followed were several tense weeks. The HOA sent me letters accusing me of escalating the situation and demanding that I remove the electrified fence. Karen showed up at my doorstep multiple times, trying to convince me that I was making things worse for everyone. She even tried to rally other neighbors to her cause, but to my surprise, most of them weren't as enthusiastic as she was. It turned out that many of them respected the fact that I was standing up for my property and didn't want to get caught up in her power plays. There were, of course, some who complained. A few neighbors voiced their concerns about the fence, claiming it was too extreme and unfriendly. But none of them seemed to understand the bigger picture. The HOA had been overstepping its bounds, and Karen had taken it too far. My ranch wasn't part of some shared community space, and I wasn't about to let them pretend it was. Despite the complaints, the HOA couldn't do anything to force me to take the fence down. They tried to impose fines, but each time I showed them my lawyer's letter and reminded them that they had no legal standing in the matter, the pressure slowly began to wane. Slowly but surely, the HOA started to back off. They realized they couldn't bully me into submission. They had underestimated my resolve. As the weeks went by, something unexpected happened. The HOA began to lose support from other residents. The more Karen pushed her agenda, the more people started to question her methods. They saw how far she was willing to go to impose her vision of community, and many began to grow tired of her constant meddling in other people's affairs. My electrified fence had become a symbol of resistance, and before long, Karen found herself isolated. Even her own supporters started to distance themselves from her extreme tactics. In the end, Karen and the HOA learned a valuable lesson. You can't take someone's property without consequences. You can't just declare land to be community space because you want it to be. And most importantly, you can't bully people into giving up what's rightfully theirs. The HOA might have thought they could win this fight, but in the end, I proved that standing up for your rights was the only way to win. The electrified fence may have been an unconventional solution, but it was effective, and it was the only way to make sure that my ranch would remain exactly that, my ranch. After the installation of the electrified fence, I braced myself for the inevitable consequences. Karen and the HOA were not the kind of people who would accept defeat quietly. I fully expected them to escalate the situation further, to find new ways to undermine me, or at least try to make my life difficult. The HOA had a lot of resources, and Karen had proven time and time again that she was willing to do whatever it took to get what she wanted. But this time, I had the law on my side, and my determination was unwavering. The electrified fence was just the first step in a series of actions that would shift the balance of power in the neighborhood. In the days following the installation, I could feel the tension in the air. Neighbors who had once avoided Karen now started to give me knowing looks when they passed by my property. It was almost as if they recognized the fence as a symbol of resistance, a symbol that said, "Don't mess with me." While some residents continued to voice their concerns, most of them seemed to understand that I was simply standing up for my rights. After all, my ranch wasn't the HOA's to control. It was mine, and I had every right to protect it. Karen, on the other hand, became more and more agitated. She continued to send letters, demand meetings, and complain to anyone who would listen. But each time she tried to push the issue, she found herself hitting a wall. The HOA board was no longer in her corner. The more she tried to rally support for her cause, the more the other neighbors started to see her for what she truly was, a power-hungry individual who believed she could impose her will on others without consequence. People had grown tired of her antics, and it was becoming increasingly clear that Karen had no real backing anymore. In a last-ditch effort to force me into compliance, Karen called a special HOA meeting to discuss my fence. She tried to paint me as a villain, saying that my actions were putting the entire neighborhood at risk. She argued that the electrified fence was dangerous, even though I had taken every precaution to ensure that it was both safe and legal. It was clear she was grasping at straws, trying to create a narrative where she was the savior and I was the enemy. But this time, the other board members weren't having it. They saw through her manipulation, and they weren't willing to side with her anymore. Karen's influence had waned. At the HOA meeting, I stood my ground, armed with legal documents, expert opinions, and a calm but unwavering resolve. I explained the situation. I emphasized that I had followed every regulation and that my fence was no different from any other form of property protection. I pointed out that Karen had no right to dictate how I used my land, and that her attempts to claim it as community property were both illegal and unethical. I made it clear that I wasn't trying to cause trouble or disrupt the peace of the neighborhood, but I would not allow my rights to be trampled. To my surprise, many of the HOA members sided with me. Some of them had privately approached me in the weeks leading up to the meeting, telling me that they admired my courage. They were tired of Karen's overreach, and they wanted to put an end to her attempts to control everyone else. Several of the board members openly expressed their frustration with Karen's leadership, and it was evident that they were ready for a change. The vote at the meeting was a landslide. The HOA unanimously agreed that I had every right to install the fence, and they officially rejected Karen's demands. Karen, of course, was furious. She stood up, her face red with anger, and tried to argue that the decision was unfair. But it was clear that she had lost. The support that she once commanded had crumbled, and there was no turning back. The fallout from the meeting was swift. Karen's influence within the HOA diminished almost overnight. The board members who had once feared her now began to distance themselves, and several of them even publicly supported my decision. People who had once been silent now spoke up, sharing their frustrations with Karen's constant meddling in everyone's affairs. It was as if a weight had been lifted from the neighborhood. People began to feel like they had a voice again, and they no longer had to live in fear of Karen's self-imposed authority. Karen's downfall wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. She had tried to impose her vision of what the neighborhood should be, forcing her ideas onto others. And in the end, she had lost. The electrified fence, which she had initially dismissed as an absurdity, had become a symbol of individual rights and resistance against tyranny. What had begun as a small act of defiance had turned into a major turning point in the neighborhood's dynamics. For me, the victory was bittersweet. While it was satisfying to know that I had successfully defended my land, it also served as a reminder of the lengths to which people like Karen would go to exert control over others. The ordeal had taken its toll on me. The stress of the legal battles, the tension with my neighbors, and the constant pressure from the HOA had worn me down. But in the end, I had proven that standing up for what's right was worth it. In the aftermath, life slowly returned to normal. The HOA, now without Karen's leadership, became more of a cooperative force in the neighborhood. There were still occasional disagreements, but the tone was different. The community had learned a valuable lesson. Power should never be taken for granted, and individual rights should always be respected. As for Karen, she retreated into the shadows. She no longer held the sway she once had, and her attempts to control the neighborhood were effectively over. As for me, I had learned a lot about the importance of standing up for myself and my rights. I had learned that sometimes it takes bold actions to protect what matters. The electrified fence wasn't just about keeping people off my land. It was about sending a message that I wouldn't back down. And in the end, that message resonated not only with Karen, but with the entire neighborhood.